Hello and welcome to the Connected Yoga Teacher podcast. I'm your host, Shannon Crow. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And this podcast is being recorded on the land of the Anishinaabe, Odawa, and Mississauga people. For me personally, it's important that I continue to learn about this land, the indigenous people who cared for it for so long, and the history and culture of my settler and immigrant ancestors. I'm a Canadian yoga teacher, mom, entrepreneur, and forever student who loves to ask questions. That's why podcasting is a good fit for me. I get to ask questions about yoga each and every week and talk to some amazing people from around the world who are also interested in yoga and topics about entrepreneurship and being better humans. So thank you so much for being here so that we can learn together. I also work as the founder of Pelvic Health Professionals. That's a place where movement educators and healthcare professionals collaborate and learn the most up-to-date information regarding pelvic health. If you'd like to join us, visit pelvichealthprofessionals.com. And because I'm a yoga teacher and I really see things through that lens, that's a huge focus for us in there. So if you want to see how we connect yoga and pelvic health, for sure, visit pelvichealthprofessionals.com. And later in today's episode, I'll tell you about our upcoming events in there. So I'm so glad that you're here today. This podcast was made for you, the yoga teacher, because I get how it feels to be out in the real world as a yoga teacher, as an entrepreneur, as someone who's trying to learn more about yoga, but also learn about how to share it out into the world and how to run a business. This podcast is a place where you can connect to other yoga teachers, ideas, and information so that you can feel supported each and every week. Shout out of thank you to Offering Tree for making today's episode possible. I use and love their software in my own business because it automates everything: bookings, payments, Zoom links, reminders, and so much more. We have a special podcast listener discount code over at offeringtree.com/Shannon. It will be applied automatically when you go to that website. So head on over to offeringtree.com/Shannon if you want to check it out. They also have a free 14-day trial. Speaking of Offering Tree, I also want to thank Eddie, one of the founders over at Offering Tree, for connecting me with today's guest, Kim. Eddie emailed me and Kim to say that we have a lot in common, that we have podcasts, that we love to talk about yoga and social justice and making yoga accessible to all people. And I love connections like this. I was on Kim's podcast recently, and if you haven't heard that yet, or if you haven't heard of her podcast, I'll make sure to link to it in the show notes. Kim actually asked me some questions that led to me sharing parts of my yoga journey that I have not talked about before. So I'll link to that in case you want to go have a listen to that. And today, Kim and I do not shy away from tough topics and questions. We're talking about yoga lineages and why they matter, if they matter, some of the dark sides of the yoga lineage, some of the abuse of power that has happened. We get right into it. And I'm so glad that Kim is brave to be talking about these things here on this podcast, but also on her podcast. Because many of us have learned, practiced, and taught yoga for years, but I recently learned from Kim that many yoga teachers are not aware of their yoga lineage at all. And there's definitely a conversation around being anti-lineage as well. Yoga teachers talk about, you know what, I don't want to get all into yoga lineage. So today we're going to talk about what is yoga lineage, why might it matter, what should we be looking at, should we be teaching yoga without understanding the history of our lineage, and also how can we be more mindful of this while we're teaching yoga, while we're communicating about this with our yoga students. And today, Kim Weeks joins me on the podcast to share her insights on all of this. Kim has over 20 years of teaching experience, training, running a business, consulting in the yoga and mindfulness industry. In 2019, you're going to hear about the work that Kim did working closely with Dr. Bir S. Khalsa, who is Associate Professor of Medicine at Harvard Medical School And they created all kinds of videos, and you'll hear Kim talk about this, in conjunction with Yoga Alliance, talking about not only Yoga Lineage, but also a huge series on science and how yoga works. And in those, they get into some real scientific discussions. So if you're a Yoga Alliance member, you can go and check out some of those. I don't know if you can check out all of them on the science topic, but I know that the lineage discussions are for Yoga Alliance members only. But good news, if you're not a Yoga Alliance member, you can also check out Kim's podcast, the Weeks Well podcast, which is about the modern practice of being your best self in your mind, breath, body, and brain. In our conversation, Kim shares more about her yoga journey, what led her to do the work that she does today, what inspired her to start sharing about science research in relation to yoga, and why she thinks it's important that we know the origins of our yoga lineage. We also get into a small discussion of my first yoga teacher training being in the Kundalini lineage. I just share a very tiny bit in this episode with Kim, and I want to say that now it's been really sitting on my mind since we chatted, and I have a lot of feelings about this that I didn't get to in our chat. And the summary of that, before we dive into it, is that I barely knew about yoga lineages when I signed up for my yoga teacher training. So I think this conversation is important so that we can have these discussions. You know, as a new yoga student, I love the class that Susie was teaching me. That was my teacher's name at the time. I really love that I had this chance to learn more about yoga. And then through Susie's teacher, Dr. Satdaram Kaur, who I actually got to see in real life and hug this weekend at our local farmers market. So I studied with Satdaram Kaur, who studied with Yogi Bhajan in Toronto. And I studied 2005 to 2006. So just to put this in context, Yogi Bhajan passed away in 2004. But in my yoga teacher training, we watched videos of his lectures in our yoga teacher training. Then fast forward, after I had become a yoga teacher in 2020, Pamela Sahara Dyson published a book called Premka, White Bird in a Golden Cage, My Life with Yogi Bhajan. And she shared her stories of abuse. And that led others to do the same. So there were sexual assault allegations against Yogi Bhajan that were proven to be likely true in a report that was done August 13th, 2020 by an olive branch. And I can link to that report in our show notes. So this is an organization that was formed in 2011 to respond to ethical misconduct in spiritual communities. And I just want to say that all of this came about thanks to this conversation with Kim, but also a really quick note by Crunch, shout out to Crunch, who writes our show notes, just saying like, maybe you want to mention the yoga lineage that you studied with, Shannon, with like a little question mark, like as we were discussing this episode. And I want to say that my initial thing was I just wanted to sort of ignore it or distance myself from the whole discussion of what was happening with the Kundalini yoga lineage. And I just want to be really transparent about that. You know, I wanted to have my experience of enjoying my classes with my teachers and not really look at it. So I get that feeling, and I also get the importance of not turning away from it and believing survivors. So we did a whole podcast on how we stand with survivors, and that was in response to Bikram planning a trip to Canada. That trip was canceled. If you want to hear about that, I'll link to that podcast episode in our show notes as well. And that is because of many yoga teachers speaking up and not turning away. So in today's episode with Kim, you're going to hear me just mention a tiny bit, but I didn't go into detail. And I think maybe it's time to do a podcast episode on this with regards to the Kundalini lineage. So I'm feeling inspired by Kim's bravery in talking about this. I'm also feeling inspired by Crunch's question to me when I was about to do the intro and outro for this. And I just wanted to say thank you to you for being part of this today, for really having a listen and giving some thoughts on this. And you can always share your thoughts in the show notes. So that's theconnectedyogateacher.com/333 for today's episode. So let's dive right into this conversation and meet Kim of the Weeks Well podcast today. Welcome to the Connected Yoga Teacher podcast, Kim. It's so great to have you here.
Thanks so much for having me. It's so nice to get to know you and get to know your work and to join you on the show.
I want to give a special shout out to Offering Tree for connecting us in an email.
Yeah.
That was really fun. I love connection emails like that. So I know we're going to talk about the lineage of yoga and get right into that and talk a bit about your podcast. But before we get into that, tell our listeners, what's the work that you do and who do you do it for?
Well, the work that I do is teaching yoga, is sharing conversations around yoga and more broadly wellness to help the audience that I have, that I believe I'm serving, to be their best selves. And that comes from 21 years now of teaching yoga, which followed a pretty high-pressured corporate career, which led me into yoga in the first place. And also in those 20 years, owning a couple of yoga and wellness businesses and working in this industry for such a long time and seeing so much of the change. So I'd like to think that I'm doing this, directly and financially for myself, because I work for myself. I don't work for anybody else. But who I'm in service to, or what I'm working toward, is this big vision of universal access to yoga practice that will improve health and well-being for all of society, regardless of age, gender, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, whatever. So that's my big, giant thing that I'm working toward and for.
That's amazing. That's why when Eddie talked to you, he was like, you should talk to Shannon.
Yes.
I feel like we share that. We both have podcasts. Yoga teachers both listen to our podcast. But yours, to me, it feels a little scary to me because you are talking about some big yoga lineages. And in that, I'm guessing you bump into also the power dynamics, the imbalance of power that happens sometimes within lineages and schools, the abuse of power that happens. Was it scary to start this?
That's a great question. No, it wasn't scary to start this. And I'll parse that one syllable word, which, my daughter has been learning and we all know is a complete sentence, begins and ends with itself. But to parse it out, no, because I had been working with or exposed to thousands of yoga teachers, yoga trainees, and the yoga interested during COVID lockdown on the subject of the scientific research on yoga, that Yoga Alliance was and still is platforming to demonstrate that there is a lot of science and research that underscores the benefits to yoga that all of us have practiced and taught and seen and witnessed and thought about, or, we've had this direct experience with these benefits. Like when I have a long, slow, steady breath, I can instantly make contact with my mind, what's happening with my mood state at that time. It doesn't necessarily mean I can change it on a dime, but a long, slow, steady breath, I'd call that a complete breath, changes my outlook. And so when we see science catching up with what we have experienced for so many thousands of years, and I'm just using a we like practitioners, it's so edifying and so nice. So Yoga Alliance hired me and Satbir Singh Khalsa, who's the Harvard medical researcher. He's an associate professor of medicine now and was an assistant at that time. They hired us to go into studio and make these 26 infomercials. I call them scientific research infomercials. That I am still sharing, and I think Yoga Alliance is also sharing to some degree beyond just to its membership, that describes the sort of research that's kind of boiled to the top that people need to know about yoga and oncology, yoga and diabetes, yoga and the menstrual cycle, not just like but the partum, the postpartum, yoga and pregnancy, like all, kind of aspects of it. It just goes on and on. Yoga and respiratory illness, yoga and asthma. So we did 26 of those, not just, and also yoga for like, transcendental, or yoga as a spiritual practice. There's been social science research on that as well. For example, we know that people get into yoga for different reasons, like stress relief. They want to get fit. It's like a fun night, like a social thing. Like I see that people are there having fun and they look really happy when they leave. I want to try it. But we now see there's a particular study from the UK, I think in 2017 or 18, that showed the majority of people, like trending 60, 70% after they practiced for a while. And those who have a really steady practice, like 3-4 times a week, say that they do it for access to their experience of spirit or spirituality. So we were doing all of that work when we went into COVID, Sapir Yoga Alliance and me. And when we went into COVID, Yoga Alliance was like, OMG, we actually know a ton of people. We're kind of a center of gravity in the yoga world. And we could just offer like one after another webinar. And you may have done one too. I don't even remember, but there were so many people that kind of cycled through in 2020. And Satya and I went on to put on 70 webinars, which were, they called it the Satya and Kim show internally, because they were at their production meetings. They were like, well, what are Satya and Kim doing this week? Because we were always on. It was just like every week or every other week, we would do one or two. In the end, did 70. We brought in various scientists. We wound up bringing some yoga practitioners in to bring the research to life. It just was an amazing experience. But in the course of talking to yoga teachers, as the moderator of those calls, Satya would present his sort of hard data, and I would field the questions. I learned that the majority of yoga teachers did not know where their teacher's teacher had studied, or which particular thread from South Asia the thing that they did had come from. And I started noticing that even Surya Namaskar, for example, which is, I think, pretty much recognized as a modern invention anyway, was getting parsed apart still further. And so people were asking questions on these calls, and we would get hundreds of questions because we would typically have between 300 to 1,500 people on the calls. So if you have 1,000-person call, you were going to have like 200 questions, or we did. And so the questions were often around, I had no idea that was the Kundalini. I had no idea that was Iyengar. I had no idea. So I started talking to the sort of Uber producer person, a good friend of mine, Trisha, and who is a consultant for them as well. And I was actually getting my hair done, and I was like, we were having this chat, and I was like, it just seems like a yoga, like a 101 on like the different main strands of modern yoga lineage would be something that would just educate people. So that the way I would start the calls with these people that I eventually brought in was, and of course it didn't work that well, but it was my approach. It was like, if I were an alien and I just like dropped out of the sky, I'm like, I mean, I guess I would probably have to deal with things like gravity and oxygen. And that's why the analogy wasn't so good. But I was like, I don't know, if I knew nothing and I walked into your yoga studio, your Iyengar yoga studio, your Vinny yoga studio, your integral yoga studio, what would happen? What would I experience, and what would happen? What could I expect in a class? And so they answered that question by teaching a class itself, just a basic level, kind of all levels yoga class that followed our conversation on the yoga, their particular lineage. So the reason that I wasn't afraid is because I'm not afraid to talk about this stuff. I think I really believe that lineage matters and needs to be brought up to the surface so that not just the millions of practitioners who've been part of these schools can find root, if they choose, in the yoga practice that they call home, let's say, in this post-COVID, really community challenged sort of space, it seems to me. Number one. Number two, I've been teaching for 20 years and I owned a studio for 14 years. And then I went out into the open market after I closed my studio. I had my kids and I was like, oh my God, like my studio is my first baby and my first baby needs to graduate. I just had to, my first baby, I couldn't do it. My husband traveled internationally and I just did not, it wrecked my practice so much that I knew I needed to regain my practice. So that's another story. But when I went out into just teaching in Washington, D.C., where I lived, 15 years after I had opened my yoga studio, I just started noticing that that the practice had become more of a like dip in and dip out sort of, and I'm not saying it's bad at all, but like once a month or once every couple months to just drop into a yoga class and maybe not take it on as this practice was what I was scratching at. Like, I guess in the end, in some ways, I wonder if we could have called it like Yoga Lineage Practice 101, because what I wanted to talk about was the practice and what I wanted, like these people that I brought in, the people I wanted to talk to have been at this for most of them over more than 40 years, like teaching people for more than 40 years. And so when I asked Lois Steinberg to come in, Iyengar yoga teacher, for another reason, I said, you come at this from a master teacher point of view. And she came back to me and was like, I don't know what a master teacher is. I know that I've been practicing yoga for 50 years. I've been teaching for 40 and I do it in the Iyengar yoga method, period. Like end of email, So all that to say, my curiosity and what I was seeing and sorry, I didn't finish the sentence. The younger students coming in, like 20 somethings, like early 30 somethings, let's say, I was thinking, how would they know? Like where to go? How would they know how to find a teacher if they wanted to really embrace the practice as a discipline, like sustainably over time? Because I think there's a lot of aspects of modern yoga that aren't sustainable over time, because there's some super harmful things that have gotten kind of absorbed down through the patriarchy. For example, Chaturanga Dandasana, the focus on that is it's based on people, first of all, boys with discipline problems that, Krishnamacharya was like, I need to get you guys in line. Let's get you doing some push-ups. You got too much testosterone as a 14-year-old boy. You've got these broad shoulders, these narrow hips, just go up and down and hold. Da, da, da. I don't think that that's a really good call for a woman over 50. I'm not sure it's a good call for women, period, although I think it is, but I just think taught the way it kind of came through the sort of start. So I started seeing like some stuff that seemed like divested from deeper, more considered places of practice where the teachers had seen over and over and over again XYZ success, XYZ failure, and XYZ kind of evolution of what they taught. But I think that you might be also getting at when you ask about the fear, well, you said it in your question, which is the power dynamics and the abuses that have, flowed through rather, so many of these lineages. I guess, and I'm super happy to unpack this and also super happy to, first of all, acknowledge, who I am, what I look like, and what kinds of privileges and advantages that I've had in the world societally. I cannot say that I've had any real advantages familially because I come from a long history of extreme abuse. And it was that abuse and trauma that got me into yoga in the first place, and the discipline of the practice and the place where I could rest my heart every time I practice, like in Shavasana and in, again, that one breath versus the next, was where I felt home. And so I just want to sort of signal that I completely understand that my place of privilege gives me blinders. Necessarily, I have blind spots around it. At the same time, when the Me Too stories started threading through, and there was all this focus on like, OMG, we should not maybe like Yoga Works, for example, was like, we think this is right before COVID hit. They were like, we might actually be mandating that teachers can't touch students anymore, like no more touch.
Right.
And my response, or my kind of like, that makes me, I'm not even sure how to say this. The majority of people practicing yoga are female or female identifying, like well over 80%. And that has been the case throughout the majority of modern yoga. Yes, earlier in the 80s, 90s, maybe even in the aughts, the power dynamic was necessarily like, not necessarily, it was patriarchally, like male teachers, teaching women, and like more men at the top and more like women on the bottom, let's say. But, back to the conversation you and I actually had when we were prepping for this call last week or the week before. There are so many normal classes occurring all over the world between very safe people teaching very safe, consenting students.
Yeah.
And most of those people happen to be female or female identifying on both sides of that coin. So when I was watching all this filter through and watching us as a group, as a society, I am not saying, please don't. It's why I like long form, I guess, because I wouldn't want what I'm saying to be clipped into something to be misunderstood or make it sound like it's something I'm not saying. I am so glad that Me Too. Thank God all of that is happening. But as a society, and I also think I'm being exclusive. I'm not trying to be, but when I say that, I want to speak as inclusively as I can, like as a group of people, humanity on the planet. We have this tendency to swing, sometimes with a lot of rage, from like point A to point Z. And there's this middle ground in between where the middle way and a more considered kind of reflective approach gets lost. And so it made me, frankly, really mad that we were focusing so much on the asshole actions of a few men who we need to talk about. Don't get me wrong. But, back to Yoga Alliance, we had this big conversation over whether we should talk to Bikram, whether he should have been included in that first group. And I said, I am not afraid to talk to him. I'm not afraid to ask him any question. I am not afraid to bring him on and let him know that's what's happening. If you want to, but we decided, and we all decided, but I was pretty strong about it too. We always thought we were going to do like a second season. And I was like, I don't want to platform him first. He doesn't deserve it. He doesn't deserve the mic. And there was a woman, Emily, I can't remember her last name, this 90-something-year-old woman who was a Bikram teacher. And I thought the better idea would be to go to her and let her speak for him, let her speak for the lineage, let her speak for it. Because ESPN did an extraordinary job getting that story out on like what he did, how he did it, and all the people that like knew, and that's the hard part. That's like this big thing that Eddie Stern and I were talking about is like how these people in the lineage are still struggling with what they could have, should have, like would have done. It's so hard. So the truth of the matter is when we produce these talks, from the very beginning, from just was like, I think we have to, like, at least Yoga Alliance, we were ready. Weekswell was ready. And Yoga Alliance, I think, was ready too. We had some emails back and forth over what would happen when the victims expressed their experiences, their feelings, were traumatized, we didn't have any trigger warnings on, like, nothing, none of that. And I had like one guest, Kate, who came on and said, I'm not answering any questions. I'm just not going to do it. I had another guest who was like, I'll answer any questions. I had another one who was like, I'll answer, but here's going to be my answer. And this is what we're going to say. And those are the three lineages. Well, and that's not true because Robert Mulhall, he's not any of the other three, who's the CEO of Kripalu, came in to speak as a white man CEO and brought a woman of color, a master teacher, Monique Schubert, who I was telling you about, who is amazing, on to speak about the lineage about like what so each school really handled it a different way. But ultimately, Yoga Alliance decided to cancel the Shivananda talk, even though they'd let the Ashtanga roll, they'd let the Kundalini roll. So it was kind of, and integral as well. So it was kind of interesting. And I think that's why they just decided, we need to like take a big step back and decide how we're going to go forward, like that, how we're going to platform this. I think that it got to a place where they just had enough people, and I'm still not totally clear about Shivananda, except that I think Shivananda was not as, according to them, was doing more hiding, doing less like, this is what happened, this is what we acknowledge, this is what we don't acknowledge, or whatever. Whereas somebody like Kino McGregor is going to come straight on and say, the practice is the practice is the practice. I personally, like Kino, never experienced anything like what my fellow practitioners, some of my fellow practitioners have experienced. And so we, as people who have inherited the tradition and inherited the practice, have to be responsible, not just for our own practice, but for taking care of those people who were victimized by Patabi Joyce, just as an example. And, and I think that's leading to bifurcation in the lineages all over the place. Kundalini is bifurcated, Ashtanga is bifurcated, Iyengar yoga is bifurcated, but not because of Iyengar, but because of Manus Manos, and so I was a really long answer, but I appreciate the question because it's so deep, and I'm super happy to keep unpacking what fear, if any, we should have to keep surfacing why or whether yoga lineage matters.
Hey, connected yoga teachers, I'm popping in here quick because last week on the podcast, I shared how I was booking a boat tour for my family and for Crunch, who's been visiting us for over a week, who's actually leaving today. She's not leaving Canada today. She's doing a bit of travel here, but she is leaving our house today. And oh my gosh, I'm going to miss her. We've had so much fun getting to know each other in real life. So for those of you who don't know, Crunch has been on our team as a writer for 5 years. She travels the world, and we finally met in person. And I have to say, in real life, Crunch is amazing. And also, I want to tell you, she's working on this new offering that I really want to give a shout out to. So if you are interested in hearing more about this, make sure to sign up for Crunch's Substack. I think this is so funny that I'm telling you about this because you're going to hear in the interview today that Kim mentioned Substack, and I didn't even know what that was. And I was like, can you clarify what that is? But you can also check out Crunch's website as well, or follow her on Instagram. So she's been traveling the world for many years on her own and with friends, and making new friends along the way. And she's really good at checking out a culture and learning about that culture, and also learning about herself along the way. And she talks about how this can be so transformative. And she's wanting to share that with others now. And I think this is such a gift. So if you ever have wanted to travel, but you don't want to go to an all-inclusive resort, or you don't want to be in a huge group of tourists, but you also don't want to travel alone, maybe that feels scary to you, then definitely reach out and connect with Crunch. So, like I said, I'll link to her website in the show notes, and her Instagram, and also her Substack. So, Crunch, when you're listening, do not leave these links out of the show notes. Okay, so back to the story that I wanted to tell you. When I booked this boat tour, there was no payment option in this. The confirmation email didn't work, and there were just these few issues that made me doubt that I had actually booked the tour. And that wasn't a great feeling as the consumer. But fortunately, the owner of the company called me right away and we had a really good chat. And in that conversation, of course, I told him about my favorite booking software, Offering Tree, that I use. And he said, okay, that's it. I've had it with this booking software that I have. I need to switch things out. I'm going to check it out. So if you are wanting to have a booking software that you can trust, that will do things automatically, like take payments, book your students in, limit how many people can book in, that will send out reminders by email or text, then visit offeringtree.com/Shannon. On there, we have a podcast listener discount code. And like I told Captain Colton, who runs the boat company called Boat the Bruce, Offering Tree is just this software that's going to automate and simplify everything in your business. It is built for yoga teachers and studios, but it's not limited to that. I also use it for my podcast bookings. So if you run any online business that's both online and in person, it's really something to check out. There's a free trial. And like I said, we have a discount code for podcast listeners over at offeringtree.com/Shannon. Now, the boat ride update, I want to tell you about that, Connected Yoga Teachers. It was amazing. If you are anywhere near the Bruce Peninsula or anywhere close in Ontario, Canada, make sure to go on this. We got to see so many islands. I think there's like 60, 70 islands. Our captain was Captain Jake. He was fantastic at telling us lots of stories about the area. And what was also fascinating is that me and my family, we didn't even know this existed near us. You know, we had been to Oliphant, that's the small little village where the boats go out from, but we had never been out beyond to see all of the small islands on there and to hear the history about them. So if you want to check that out, special shout out to Boat the Bruce. I'll link to their website in our show notes as well. Alrighty, let's get back into today's episode with Kim Weeks, where we talk about yoga lineages and what we need to think on or consider when it comes to this topic. So tell me about that. Tell me why you're so passionate about people knowing their yoga lineage. So let's look at that. And then let's look at how they can find that out if they don't know. That's really fascinating that lots of yoga teachers didn't know.
Yeah, so many. That was the impetus for sure. It's a good question. So why does it matter is the question, right?
Yeah, like some people might be listening to this and thinking, well, it's all yoga.
It's so yoga is the cessation of the modifications of the mind, like plus or minus. We could probably put underneath the word set. Okay, so yoga is, there's no other word for that, remains, cessation and modifications and mind are like the three other words in there of the, are going to be fine. So you've got yoga is of the, so that put those off to the side. If we talk about cessation, we talk about modifications, we talk about mind. Those are the three components that the human being, when going into practicing yoga, is endeavoring to explore. Definitionally, okay, if we're just going to, yoga is, like on the other side of that sentence, is that. Now, yoga filtered through other sources before it got to Patanjali, amalgamating. Okay, so Patanjali was pulling at that time. I've got a podcast dropping next Tuesday. Does anybody say dropping anymore? Do you say that?
You're allowed to.
Am I dropping it from the sky? No, I am not. So dropping just sounds so dramatic. So I am uploading to the cloud, a second conversation that I have with Doug Keller, who is a, kind of former Anusara. He actually, and I really feel bad, he talked about his teacher before John Friend, for a while. And I always forget the name of that person and I feel really bad. I don't know. But anyway, he is, he's sort of an academic, comes from a kind of a PhD background, blah, blah. I think he's just short of the dissertation PhD. So he comes in and he sort of is able to hold a ton of information together and kind of thread it through. And this sort of says, I think, a lot about my audience. It's one of the most popular podcasts that I've released because it's like one of those things you, first of all, should listen to more than once. Maybe that's why it's popular. I've had downloads multiple times because you're like, oh, I don't understand what he said. Let me rewind. But anyway, he talks about how Patanjali was trying to be a bit of a revolutionary, a bit of a middle pather, a bit of a guy who pulled from a bunch of different kind of debating sources at that time. So the summary that yoga is the cessation of the modifications of the mind is relatively fair, even though yoga has this major tantrika side, which of course we see surfacing between the sutras and the Pradipika, but also the sort of Vedic side and the Sankhya side. And so the Sankhya Vedic side is going to follow that one treatise, that one sutra, that one thread pretty closely. So if what we're doing is observing the mind in a yoga practice, it takes time, it takes repetition, it takes different like, it's like a Rubik's cube. It takes a different, not a different approach every time. But if I were going to try to cease the modifications of my mind, like one time in my life, I would be doing yoga at that one time in my life. But that one time in my life, given that I'm living for hundreds of millions of minutes in my life, is not going to have that much influence on the rest of my life if I'm only doing this teeny little fractional part. So it seems to me that lineage matters because it gives you, it's like a map. Like if you walked out of your house and you didn't really know like you had to go someplace, it would be helpful at least to know like which direction is the sun, which direction is it going to set, like, and therefore like what's north, south, east, and west. So lineage also came up outside of the free market. It came up and expanded, without question, intersected through Vivekananda began intersecting via the free market. But it came up before that. It came up between teachers and students in a situation where the teacher would practice the same sets of things that the overarching lineage or school, let's say, had determined was a thing that should be practiced. And then the students came in and practiced what the teacher practiced. And then just like math or just like philosophy or just like English literature, like I'm reading a book right now, this, woman who went to the same school I did, but like 10 years after me. And it's so fun because she's closer to like school, and just watching her kind of thread in like, English literature criticism is so badass. It's like, yes, that's how you analyze literature, is by pulling, criticism from other places and just sort of figuring out what it means like on the page. So I think like late stage capitalism has unmoored us. I think we're sort of floating around trying to figure out where to spend our money and how, and what a zero sum situation the sort of amassing of wealth has been for so many people, amassing the wealth at the expense of others, and how yoga is a practice, just like I was saying, is, in my opinion, it should be universally accessed, regardless of any place, stage, state, or circumstance. But there has to be the thing that we're actually like arriving on planet Earth, like right now, you and me, or a student of mine and me, or two other students, people completely, where we have some sort of common thread that we're talking about, that we're actually trying to do, in recognition that if we do it one time out of the 400 million minutes we're alive in life, the benefit gets kind of lost, like a sand granule gets lost on the beach. Like maybe, lineage just is about building sandcastles and knocking them down, making structures. But I think the mind need structure. Like we need grammar. Like if we start, like, Kino, in a conversation I released with her recently, it wasn't the lineages, it was a follow-up she and I did, talked about the poses as grammar, which I never thought about that as a concept, but it works for me, where if you're going to learn how to communicate, it's in whatever language, it's helpful to start at the beginning. It's helpful to start and identify what's a noun, what's a verb, what's a direct object, what's an indirect, and what is it that you're trying to say. And so babies obviously communicate less effectively than 25-year-olds, although as we discussed with their children, maybe not. Maybe not. But anyway, so I think that I hope that wasn't too long an answer. Happy to answer, others, but I think about why I think it matters all the time, and I haven't really articulated it like this in this format ever. So thank you for asking. Mhm.
I like how you gave the analogy of the map.
Mhm.
It made me think of, like, my first yoga teacher training was in Kundalini, and it was
Mhm.
very important to my teacher, and I'm sure her teacher, who was Yogi Bhajan, to let us know this chain, the golden chain, I think it was called, of our lineage, of like where our yoga came from. And I appreciate you saying, like, okay, I wasn't afraid to unpack these. I already was. There was some pushback. There still are some
Mhm.
things. There's a lot of
For
things
sure.
to look at. And I think what I'm hearing from you is we have this map, or we have the grammar, we kind of have the structure, or the sandcastle. That was a good analogy as well.
Yeah.
Breaking the sandcastles down was a good one. So that we can examine it and look at it. So how do we find out our yoga lineage if we're like, I don't know, I took like a 200-hour from the lady down the street from me. I have no idea what lineage that would be.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think that I'm going to put core power off to the side, because I think there's a lot of that training that's going on, and I'm not exactly sure where to place them. Although I know somebody here in fact, I was had a conversation, another podcast with, and I think Andrea Ferretti's. You've talked to her, right? No, okay.
Not yet, Andrea.
Yeah,
Reach out. I know we
I
were
know,
trying to.
she's great. She's great, and she's doing this great Substack. She's so great. Anyway, but she goes to Core Power, and we were talking a little bit about I don't know what, but like her at Yoga Journal, rightly, being called a yoga snob. She was like, if I had 1,000, handstands in front of me, I was going to pick the one that looked the best. And I want to get back to that, because I actually think that whole, like, the one that looks the best thing is really interesting. There's so many different facets of that, like, statement. But anyway, she takes this core power class, and I was sharing with her that I know somebody here in Denver where I've just moved. It's like, I'm the land of the million coffees. Would anyone in Denver like to have coffee with me? I'm available. But she was like, she's been in the wellness industry for a long time on the financial side of it. And she was like, she was, said, sort of use more colorful language in this, but screw you if you don't call core power yoga yoga. It is. It is yoga. She's very passionate about it. Saying, so putting that off to the side for a second, because I personally am not quite sure. I haven't researched core power enough to know where it is, but there's so much of it that I want to acknowledge that, I guess, that I'm not sure where to place it. But if you have taken a 200-hour training program and flow, like Surya Namaskar, sun salutes of any kind, have been grounded or centered in your practice, then the Ashtanga lineage is likely the direction you would want to head. So if I were a recent 200-hour trained graduate, I would go to my teacher trainers and say, who were your teachers? I would go online after that to find out their teachers' teachers, and I would follow the thread as far as, it suited me. And if it were me, I would go, to the oldest person practicing in, and even then, as now, myself personally, I would choose a woman. If I had the choice, I would choose a woman, and go learn from them and go ask them like, what's happening. So that's what I would say. If I think Kundalini has a very clear thread, and it's difficult, just like with, although Iyengar yoga is a little different, to trace that back. Maybe you could tell me. I think that that's true because all the Kundalini people I know who've studied for, I've been practicing for 30 years, and people I know them practicing Kundalini for longer than that can pretty easily trace their thread back to Yogi Bhajan.
Yeah. Yeah. It's pretty easy. It was put in the curriculum 20 years ago when I took it anyway. It was right in there. And our teacher talked a lot about Yogi Bhajan because she had studied with him.
Yeah. And that's an interesting thing because you wind up quoting your teacher big time, don't you?
You do. So what about that then? What about when you start researching and you're like, oh crap, because I remember my feelings when all of the abusive power was coming
I'm
out.
so sorry. It must have been terrible.
Well, yes and no.
Yeah.
There were a lot of reactions. It was like, well, that's not my experience. My teacher wasn't Yogi Bhajan, my teacher was great. So I can separate. And lots of people are saying like, separate the yoga from the person. There's all of those arguments.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, the question is, can we separate the physics from Einstein? Will we be able to separate electric cars from Elon Musk? Can we separate justice in the West from Martin Luther King?
Right.
All three of those men, posthumously, did and are doing harmful things, particularly to women. In the case, but particularly in the case of Martin Luther King and Einstein. But they changed the world forever for the better. They changed our consciousness. They changed the way we think about all the interactions that we have with each other by defining the right side of history, the right side of existence. And so I don't know, is Patabi Joyce like an Einstein? I don't know,
right. Like,
but
anyone
at the same
who's
time,
upset by it and the people who have, been subjected to the abuse, then they're the people also that need a voice in the conversation.
They need to be well, and that's exactly why I'm so, I was, of course, like in the short term, I was so bummed that Yoga Alliance didn't want to continue with the lineages conversation, just because, of course, they have a bigger platform than I do. But at the same time, I really respected, because, a woman who had been sex trafficked, who's, I cannot remember her name. I think she's Dutch. You might know her name. She was working for them, a consultant. She's got a bunch of TEDx's out there that are just, it's just, it was, I couldn't, listening to her talk, I canceled the rest of my afternoon. I just had to sit and think about that. And so she brought to them her concerns about the yoga lineages conversation, was like, I just don't think that this is right. But the thing is, the cat was already out of the bag. Most of the stuff had already happened. I mean, I think that's why the lineages conversations are behind the member paywall, because I think, understandably, Yoga Alliance wants to manage that conversation, and I really respect that. I really do. And so, if the lineages disintegrate because the current leaders are not able to hold space for the victims and their experiences, and the fact that they refuse, let's say, to separate the yoga practice from the yoga teacher, then that is exactly what needed to have happened. I guess, to me, that's correct is not the word I really like to use, but I think that's exactly how it should be if that lineage can't contain. And that's what's happened with so many senior Ashtanga practitioners, and what certainly is also happening within the Iyengar yoga world around the fact that, Mission Command in Pune, India, is like, you are not allowed to take a Manuso Manos class. And if you do, you'll lose your certification. So then it sets up this whole like underground thing. Like people, there are thousands of people in the Iyengar yoga world who love Manuso Manos. And so what do? And so it just sets up this, it just sets up another kind of power dynamic within the school and probably bifurcates the school. I guess my thing is, the 20th century and so much of the time leading up to that, especially from the 14th century, when we started sort of figuring out, generally speaking, how to tell time, like it's 11:01, it's 11:02, to get the monks to meditation on time. And it was like the driving urge to like splice time the way we do. We've just become a very mechanistic species, very linear, it's funny, the linear lineages, like left to right, top down, at least in the English language. Of course, you read the opposite direction in the East. Um, and it seems to me that these people, these men, invented systems of an approach to the cessation of the modifications of the mind and had enough leadership capacity slash practiced information slash wherewithal to create a system that so many other people were willing and able to join. But now I think we're in this century, and this is the thing I was saying, overnight between our Kundalini call and the class that occurred the next day, Weeks Well got a bunch of emails, Yoga Alliance got a bunch of emails, correctly saying like, why aren't you talking about the people that were so harmed by this man and by the people who stood by and let it happen? And so the next day, and I'll say it again, I said exactly this, like, we are attempting here to talk about the practice itself. To the extent we talk about the human being that started the practice, that, and again, I just keep going back to how Kino has arrived at this place. Human beings are fallible. And it seems to me, I mean, we don't really know what it would be like with a world with lots of women in power. We have no idea. Okay, so who knows if women would do the same thing? But we can say safely that lots of men in power lose themselves. And maybe predators from the very beginning, they don't lose anything. They actually get what they want because they're like, like aiming to abuse from the very beginning. I can't speak for them. I don't know. But that was what I tried to say and let Pritpal, Khalsa, who at the time was the head of 3HO organization, say the same thing. But they were and remain in like major litigation over it. I mean, who knows when that's going to end? And that's the way that those victims, for example, within that school are seeking their restitution. And I think that talking about it more and more and more is better. But I also think that the practices within these lineages, in many cases, are exquisite. And they have created so much benefit and like lifelong freedom for so many people because these people are continuing to practice these things. And so in this moment, if I'm practicing and I'm consenting to my practice and I'm not being abused in my practice, and the practice itself, whatever it is, my long, slow, steady breath, my headstand, my seated forward fold, my yoga nidra, whatever, if that feels really good to me, isn't that okay? Regardless of which. And so I feel like I've not been, I've never really tried to be verbose at all. I really haven't. But I feel like the so many lineage practices give you a real depth and sort of like through line to practices that lots and lots and lots of people have practiced over decades and decades, centuries in some cases. that work. And I'm not sure if like flamingo pose works over like decades long. Like, I don't know if my mom should do flamingo pose, I think my kids should, but and I'm not trying to speak critically of anything. I'm just saying that like flamingo is untested, and there's the majority of lineage practices, in fact, have been tested and have blown people's minds. So
it's really nuanced. I appreciate your thoughts on this. And if our connected yoga teacher listeners want to learn more about the lineages and dive further into this, where do they go listen to that?
Well, if they're Yoga Alliance members, they can and should. I would so strongly recommend they go behind the member paywall and start at the beginning, and start with where both Yoga Alliance and I agreed were the 6, of course 7, it was 7 with Shivananda, but Shivananda never made it, to air, or the 6 conversations that we thought were the ones to start with. And that's because and this is modern yoga now. We had a whole second season, third season, where we get deep dive into Vedanta and deep dive into like Jainism. There's so many. And, Doug Keller talks a lot about that. So I would start there. And then on my site, weekswell.com, and on my podcast, I've brought everybody that I talk to back on, I think with the exception of Robert Mulhall, the CEO of Kripalu. But everybody else has come back on. And it wasn't, he didn't not want, I just haven't asked him yet. But and then others. And then I've brought in the post lineage and the anti lineage and the non lineage people. There've been a lot. There've been I can Avery is going to come in and talk to me about being creating an LGBTQ space for lineage practitioners and what she does, what they do there. And so, for example, so I want to, well, and of course, Jivana and Anjali have come on to talk, especially, and Anjali is a fascinating conversation of like, her thing is every second of every day you can be doing yoga. You should do that. So listening to those kinds of conversations are also helpful as a point counterpoint, because that's what I'm really trying to do, is offer point counterpoint, is like grow this body of knowledge where somebody like Sean Korn says, I'm totally grounded in the teachings of the lineages, plural, but I'm so inspired by being this woman in this body, in this world at this time. And that's like, so like we just released her conversation yesterday. So I think you could thread your way through all these conversations and you could hear both, I still haven't brought anybody from Bikram on because I'm still really wondering how to have that conversation,
That's a tough conversation to have.
And I should say, back to your quick, like if somebody's has had a hot yoga teacher training, if you are doing hot yoga, you are doing it in the lineage of Bikram Chaudhry.
Yes.
Straight up. I mean, that's what you're doing. And if you're doing alignment-based yoga, you're doing it in the tradition of the Iyengar yoga system. So you should go, if you're doing it in a more restorative sort of, I'm so sorry. I know you asked me this question. I was like, well, I'll just like go off and talk. But, like Vinny yoga, for example, and I think yin yoga has a lot more to do with, classes like, or practices like Vinny yoga than they do with any other particular practice. And you could also, I'm actually haven't yet reached out to Sarah Powers, but soon will. Her and Paul Grilly, who were the founders of yin yoga, basically, along with this Japanese guy that taught them, because he taught from the chakras and taught how to open up the channels of the body via compressing the joints and these supine holds that have now really taken off. So if you had a yin yoga training or yin anything, you would be going to Paul and to Sarah.
Is there an online resource like a family tree kind of lineage map that we can?
No. There's not that I know of. The only thing I do know about is my friend's Caroline Neville Hamilton and Frank Hamilton. Do you know them?
No.
They're so great. So she's a designer. He also is too, but more tech guy. And I'm just looking at this poster. We should put the link in. It's called the Yoga Tree, and she drew it years ago. And when I interviewed Beryl Bender-Birch from the Power Yoga tradition, basically. So by the way, if you did like a power yoga training of any kind, you would either be going to Brian Kest out in LA or Beryl Bender. They're the two that really are the kind of mom and dad of of power yoga. But anyway, there's this really cool, huge poster that you can see online. We should definitely put in the show notes that would give people this big giant tree of yoga that shows the roots and all the branches that flower out. So,
Okay. We'll link to that in the show notes.
yeah.
This is really fascinating. I'd love to hear from our listeners who have further questions because I think we could keep chatting on this. And
Yeah.
I hope some of them also reach out to you for your podcast if they maybe they are having questions about a lineage, or maybe they have a new perspective about it. I'm excited to see what collaborations and connections come out of this conversation and what questions for sure.
I'd love it. I'd love to answer any questions. And, I've just started a Substack, so it's worth like checking out. Basically what I'm doing there is just trying to encourage conversation. We have a blog and we've got,
Can you explain to me what Substack is?
Yes. So there's this amazing writer named George Saunders, an American writer, who I learned about through a podcast. I was like, inhaling during COVID. And he calls Substack social media with a conscience.
Okay.
So starting from that like umbrella term, it's just his brand for it. And he's like, I think he's won a bunch of like either Faulkner Awards or, National Book Awards, whatever. He's like kind of that level writer. His short stories and books are amazing. And he's very active on Substack. And I think maybe a bit of an early adopter. I'm not sure. I've been getting Substacks now for like a couple years. It is a communications tool wherein you, the writer or the creator, post a thing that you've written. The thing is distributed to your audience in the form of an email. But the email has enough code in it it has enough code in it that you can brand it with your colors and some of your kind of stuff that like you feel like is you. But it also has it's like a built-in an app that builds in the process of upgrade to paid, upgrade to paid, upgrade to paid. Now, not in an obnoxious way. I guess as the creator, you could like every other sentence, like as you're writing it, you're writing like, oh, this is my thing. I'm blogging. I'm whatever. Upgrade to paid, and like, oh, and then upgrade to paid. You could be obnoxious about it, but I've never seen anybody be that way. Where you have your free subscribers, people who just are on your list and get your thing, and then your subscribers who upgrade to paid. So it's not only, and they don't tell, and they Substack don't tell you, just upgrade to paid willy-nilly. They give you like $8 a month. How about $80 a year? How about $200 for like a founding membership, something. But that email, and this is the important part, lives in an already designed, almost word spacey or Squarespacey or WordPressy or Squarespacey sort of homepage. So they are, Squarespace is, in my opinion, Squarespace has innovated / disrupted completely the news making, communications giving sort of blogosphere. They're the next sort of like step up from the blogosphere. So if you get a Substack and you go to you have to follow, a Substacker.
Okay.
And if you follow the Substacker, you then will get how the email, the posts, whenever your creator sends them. You also then wend your way back to this homepage where lots of other stuff can just be posted. The creator can have you drop down menus, goes to your site, goes to the something we're doing behind the member paywall, something else, something free content, something whatever. And it creates it. They have done an extraordinary design and content play, basically, that instantly makes you feel like you are part of something. You are part of a community. You're part of whatever the creator is writing. Like the first guy that I followed is the Convivial Society. This guy, MK Sakasis, who doesn't own a phone, who, like the podcast that I heard him listen to, he used a map to get to the physical studio where he was like recording in person. So this guy, he is like as off the grid as you can be, except when he substacks to tell his listeners about what technology is doing to our brains and how we might be like more conscious consumers of it. For example, I'm really interested, obviously, in like consciousness. So if somebody's writing about consciousness or reducing like stress from work and using whatever practices, that's what I'm into. So I hope that was a good
really
description
cool.
of Substack.
I love that he didn't have a phone, but yet he had Substack. And I feel like I just keep hearing it, and I just think it's a blog or a newsletter. A paid newsletter is what I thought it was.
Yeah, no, it's a free newsletter, potentially paid newsletter. You can kind of have like an above the fold, below the fold. They've got a whole, interestingly, they've actually inverted that idea. They've inverted the above the fold, like below the fold is like, well, maybe that's not true. Well, they've inverted it in terms of the way you take it in as a reader, but below the fold used to be, and, sort of newspaper is like the less important stuff. But now above the fold is theoretically the more broader, kind of less important stuff. And below the fold, which is where you go into if you are a paid subscriber, is theoretically, not even theoretically, because you're paying for it. It's the more valuable stuff because you're paying for it and the person you're paying is spending more time or whatever creating that content. So they've really taken this. I think we're just in a modular age where like things are moving around a lot. Like I know I said probably very provocative things about these extraordinary men in history that have changed the world. But I think we're at a time when we're in this modular age where like things are all moving around and like what does matter and where do I put my eyes? Like where do I focus? And, Substack has reinvented long form.
Oh, that's fascinating. Well, if our Connected Yoga Teacher listeners are using Substack, I want to hear from you.
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you so much for this today, Kim. And thanks for the work that you're doing on your podcast and the videos that you've put out. I'll make sure that we link to your website and people can connect with you there.
Yeah. Thanks for the time. Thanks for bringing me on.
Well, Connected Yoga Teachers, I want to hear your thoughts on this. I am so grateful to Kim for doing this interview, for really inspiring me, and also to Crunch, our show notes writer, because I feel like it gave me the courage to look a little bit more at my own yoga lineage. I knew what lineage that was for my first yoga teacher training. My second yoga teacher training, I could do the same thing. I could take a look at that one as well. I sort of know where it started, but I'm definitely interested in digging into it a little bit further. So I actually started to listen to some podcasts on the Kundalini yoga lineage, and I did a little inner work on why I've been avoiding this in my 6 years of podcasting. So if you feel like you know more about the Kundalini yoga lineage and you want to chat with me, maybe on the podcast, maybe not on the podcast, or if you know someone or an episode or an article or something, send it my way. I'm here to listen and learn. If I'm missing a part of this conversation, I'd love to hear from you. If you are a fellow Kundalini trained yoga teacher at some point, also reach out to me. Let me know your thoughts on this. You can share your thoughts right in our show notes page if you want to be more in discussion with anyone who looks at this episode in our website. That's at theconnectedyogateacher.com/333. Or you can leave a comment in our Facebook group. That's the Connected Yoga Teacher Facebook group. Or you can send me a private email or voice message right from our website. So the voice message button is really cool. If you look over on the right-hand side of our website, you can press that button and I hear those messages directly. If you have time to join me in person and you want to learn about sounding and pelvic health, Shobana Mani, who has been inside of our Pelvic Health Professionals membership for a long time, who always has very cool things to share with our members, who is in the membership. She is going to be doing a call with us on August the 15th. It will be recorded, so if you're listening to this after August the 15th of 2023, not to worry. We've got you covered with the replay, but we're going to really talk about the benefits of sounding in regards to pelvic health. So if you want to check that out, visit pelvichealthprofessionals.com to join. We also have a couple yoga series already in there, and we have a really exciting one coming up in September. We're putting all the dates and details together. I might even have a link for you soon. We're going to do one, yoga for endometriosis, and that's with Sarah Garden. We're very excited about that. So to check all that out, again, it's pelvichealthprofessionals.com. Thank you so much to our entire team, Suzanne, Crunch, and Sinead. And we've also made an executive decision that we need to get together more in person. But thank you so much to our entire team who makes this podcast possible. And thank you to you, dear listener. Maybe we should also get together with our listeners. So if you're up for that, let me know if you want to make that happen in some way, or if that's of interest to you. How fun would that be if we hung out in real life and just did fun things? Our week here with Crunch has been about swimming, touring around, hiking, just enjoying the garden. Crunch has been so helpful in the garden. Oh my gosh, because it's been some pretty warm days here. So if you are up for any of that, let me know. And in the meantime, I would love to know, what will you be doing this week to stay connected to yourself, your yoga practice, and to your community, so that you can share the yoga that lights you up.